Hello, Namaskar. This is Firstpost and you're watching Vantage with me, Palki Sharma. China is at it again, claiming Indian lands and naming Indian lands. The latest provocation comes in Arunachal Pradesh. India has given a stern response. But what does all of this mean? Chinese maps won't change the reality on the ground in India, and Indian rebuttals won't change China's policy. We look at the history of this conflict and what lies ahead. Also, is China a developing country? The Americans say it's not. They've passed a bill saying this. Why should Beijing care? Why does it call itself developing? We'll discuss that. The yuan is challenging the dollar. They're talking about an Asian currency now. The war in Ukraine is intensifying with Russian drones raining on Odesa. Japan is worried. It wants to build bomb shelters for its people. Germany is running out of people. It wants to import them. Saudi Arabia is leading a realignment, reworking power equations in the region. And amid all of this, some parents want to raise genderless babies. Not he or she, they're they. They're calling them babies. This is our world. Pronouns are political. The headlines first. Heavy security in New York as Donald Trump gets ready to appear in court. He's the first former US president to face criminal charges. Trump was indicted for hush money payment to porn star Stormy Daniels. The US says a top ISIS commander was killed in its airstrikes in Syria. Khalid al-Jabouri, the terrorist responsible for planning attacks in Europe, has been eliminated. Australia joins the anti-TikTok club. It has banned the app from government devices. Beijing lodges a protest. The US, the UK, France and New Zealand, among others, have already banned Chinese-owned TikTok over security concerns. A Swedish court pulls up the police for banning protests over the burning of the Quran. It says the police were wrong. Quran burning incidents in Sweden sparked fury in Muslim countries like Turkey, which put its NATO bid on hold. And the UK's Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, slams British Pakistani men, accusing them of harming white English girls. She says the police are turning a blind eye due to political correctness. China's expansionism knows no bounds. First Doklam, then Eastern Ladakh, and now Arunachal Pradesh. China has launched a new campaign to provoke India. It is renaming parts of Arunachal Pradesh. Arunachal Pradesh is a state in India. China is targeting 11 places in this state. It has issued new names, Chinese names, for these places. And India has hit back with a sharp response. This episode began on Sunday. Chinese Ministry of Civil Affairs released a list. It had 11 places with a map. All these places are in the Indian state of Arunachal Pradesh, and China is claiming all of these as Chinese territory. Beijing says these places are part of what it calls southern Tibet. It has a Chinese name for Arunachal Pradesh. Beijing calls it Zhangnan. And the new Chinese map, the one that was released on Sunday, shows most of Arunachal Pradesh. It has 5 mountain peaks, 2 land areas, 2 residential areas and 2 rivers. One of the towns on this list is close to Itanagar. Itanagar is the capital of Arunachal Pradesh in India. So China is taking claim by giving Chinese names to Indian towns. And this is not a first. The Chinese have tried this before. In 2017, the Dalai Lama visited Arunachal Pradesh. China did not like it. It retaliated with a list with Chinese names for 6 Indian towns or regions. Then in 2021, China released another list. This one had 15 places. And now in 2023, there's a new list with 11 names on it. How does it help? What does China gain by giving Chinese names to Indian territories? It's a way to build pressure. It's a way to needle India. And China's justification is unbelievable. It says it's just standardizing geographical names. I have a copy of the Chinese notification with me, the one that sparked the latest row. Listen to what it says. According to the relevant provisions of the State Council on the Management of Geographical Names, China's Ministry of Civil Affairs, together with relevant departments, has standardized some geographical names in southern Tibet. The third batch of supplementary place names for public use in southern Tibet, 11 in total, is now officially announced. It's a carefully worded statement, and it has one clear takeaway. This order came from the top. China's top leadership is the driving force behind this. And how did we reach this conclusion? Because this is a formal official order released by China's Ministry of Civil Affairs, and this is in line with instructions from China's State Council. The State Council is the cabinet of the Chinese government. So I repeat, the decision came from the top. And China has made a unilateral declaration here. It violates India's sovereignty. What is India's reaction? New Delhi has issued a firm statement. Here's what the Ministry of External Affairs in New Delhi said, and I'm quoting, "This is not the first time China has made such an attempt. We reject this outright. Arunachal Pradesh is, has been, and will always be an integral and inalienable part of India. Attempts to assign invented names will not alter this reality." So that's a clear message from New Delhi. And this statement, like similar statements in the past, will not alter the reality that China claims the whole of Arunachal Pradesh. This is a long-standing dispute. India and China share a border that is 3,488 kilometers long. The border is not demarcated, and China misuses this fact. There are repeated flare-ups. The border is divided into three areas: the western sector, which is around Ladakh, the middle sector that covers Himachal Pradesh and Uttarakhand. Tibet is on the other side of this boundary, that's the middle sector. And the third area is the eastern sector, around Arunachal Pradesh and Sikkim. And this is the area, the eastern sector, that we're talking about today. Now, time for a quick history lesson. The boundary in the eastern sector is called the McMahon Line. It is the de facto border. It was drawn in the year 1914 during the British Raj. I'm talking about the famous Shimla Convention. That's when leaders from Britain, China, and Tibet met. The convention was called to settle the boundary dispute. At that time, Tibet was still free, and China was trying to push its claims on the region. India was still under the British rule. This is 1914. And India was represented by Sir Arthur Henry McMahon, the then Foreign Secretary, which is why this border is called the McMahon Line. It is named after the British Foreign Secretary of 1914. So in Shimla, they presented a proposal to resolve the border dispute. But China refused to sign it, because China said it owns Tibet and that Tibet had no independent authority to enter into international agreements. China did not like the fact that Tibet was being represented as a separate entity in this convention. But Tibet was there, and the draft was signed by two of the three parties. China did not sign it. The British government that ruled India signed it, and the Tibetan government in Lhasa also signed it. The Tibetans were represented by a man called Paljor Dorje Shatra. He was as good as their prime minister. And China objected to all of this, specifically to the status of Tibet. But China did not object to the McMahon Line, and this is very important. For 45 years, the Chinese never raised any formal objections to the McMahon Line. Then in 1959, they shifted abruptly. China's prime minister at the time was Zhou Enlai. In 1959, he wrote a letter to Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru. Listen to what he said in that letter. This is the Chinese Prime Minister saying, "The so-called McMahon Line was a product of the British policy of aggression against the Tibet region of China and has never been recognized by any Chinese central government and is therefore decidedly illegal." And this is the origin of China's claims on Arunachal Pradesh, a flawed interpretation of history, a version that suits China's expansionist agenda. During the 1962 war, Chinese forces crossed the McMahon Line. They made deep inroads into India, but then they also retreated after announcing a unilateral ceasefire. And now, almost 6 decades later, China is reigniting the dispute. It is changing names and staking claim to Arunachal Pradesh, and the timing is typical. Every time there's an important engagement with India, the Chinese side provokes. And this month, India is hosting the defense ministers of the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO. Both India and China are members, and this year, India holds the rotating presidency of this group. China's defense minister is expected to attend the meeting in India. and the Chinese side is playing its old games. The question is, what should India do? Should India reconsider the invite? Or should it host the Chinese and confront them with their claims? Whatever India chooses to do, one thing is certain: silence won't help. China sees silence as a sign of weakness, and it only understands the language of strength. So India should use its presidency and its global clout to call out China's provocations. The US, for one, is speaking out against China and also walking the talk for a change. This week, the Americans have opened a new front against Beijing. It's about a simple question: is China a developing country? US lawmakers say it's not. They say China is not a developing country, and they introduced a bill in the US House of Representatives. That's the lower house of the US Congress. The bill is aptly titled, "The People's Republic of China is Not a Developing Country Act." There's no room for doubt. It spells out what it wants to say very clearly. It is addressed to the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken. The bill says Blinken should launch a diplomatic campaign at international organizations. He should ensure that China is stripped of the label of a developing country. And this bill has been passed unanimously. 415 to 0, that's the final tally of votes. 415 to 0, it tells you how strong the sentiment against China is. Every lawmaker in American House, the US House, voted in favor of this bill. It now moves to the Senate for a vote. And it's not just the US that is pushing for this. Europe too believes that China should not be categorized as developing. In October 2021, the European Union published a review. Here's what it said about China, and I'm quoting: "One way for China to show leadership would be by refraining from claiming benefits that would correspond to a developing country in ongoing negotiations." And Australia is of the same view. In 2021, Australia asked China to give up its access to special and differential treatment as a developing country. So the idea has wide support. But why is this distinction important? How does it matter if China is called developed or developing? Do these labels really have any meaning? Well, they do, and they do make a lot of difference. As of today, all leading international organizations bracket China as a developing country. We're talking about the United Nations, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, or WTO. All of them call China developing. And on what basis do they do this? How is one country called developing and another called developed? You see, each organization has its own criteria. The World Bank, for instance, classifies countries on the basis of gross national income. But the WTO does not accept this definition. In fact, the WTO has no benchmarks whatsoever. At the World Trade Organization, every member can allocate itself into the group it wants to. So each member decides how it wants to be categorized. The WTO has 164 members, and 2/3 of these members call themselves developing countries. That's around 109 countries. They're developing. And India is part of this list, so is China. As per the rules, if China wants to call itself developing, then it will be labeled as a developing country at the World Trade Organization. But why does China want this label? Because it translates into significant gains for Beijing. Developing countries get some benefits. They can take longer to implement a deal. They also get more trade, and they get preferential treatment. The idea is to help developing countries, to give them a better playing field. But China has been accused of misusing these privileges. There's a long list of charges against China, like preferential treatment for state enterprises, data restrictions, lack of enforcement of intellectual property rules. Basically, China rigs the global system in its favor. That's the charge against it. Of course, China denies it. But even then, its label as a developing country is hard to justify, really. China is the world's second largest economy. It accounts for 18.6% of the global economy. It has the most billionaires in the world, the highest number. Out of the world's top 100 companies, 14 are Chinese. And yet China wants to be called developing because it wants to enjoy special benefits. It wants the same perks as countries like Zimbabwe and Papua New Guinea get. And as of today, it is getting those perks, thanks to loopholes in the international system. There is no definition of a developing country because the world cannot agree to a definition. Just like there's no accepted definition of terrorist, because on issues that matter the most, there's usually no consensus. So the China of fact check books is still developing. Can American influence strip China of this title? We'll have to wait to find out. Meanwhile, the Chinese currency is growing stronger with each passing day. As the world dumps the US dollar, more and more countries are turning to the Chinese yuan. Last week, it was Brazil. It began bilateral trade in the yuan, and now Malaysia has announced its plans. Malaysia wants to set up an Asian monetary fund. Malaysia's Prime Minister is Anwar Ibrahim. He met with Chinese President Xi Jinping last week. Both leaders were in Hainan. Ibrahim informed his parliament about the discussions. He said he was the one who pushed for this idea. And I have some quotes from the Malaysian Prime Minister. When I had a meeting with President Xi Jinping, he immediately said, I refer to Anwar's proposal on the Asian Monetary Fund, and he welcomed discussions. There is no reason for Malaysia to continue depending on the dollar. So Malaysia wants an Asian Monetary Fund, and China supports the idea. But what purpose will it serve? It has two goals. Number one, replace the US dollar with an alternative currency. And number two, reduce reliance on the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, the lender of last resort for countries. The IMF bails out countries in economic distress. China and Malaysia want to build an alternative to the IMF. They want to kill two birds with one stone, create an Asian IMF and curb dependence on the US dollar. And in both ways, they challenge the United States. Because the US dollar is still the dominant global currency and the US government still has an outsized influence on the IMF, which also explains why China is interested in the project. Although it's not really a new idea, it was first proposed by Japan back in the 1990s. This was during the Asian financial crisis. Asian economies were under considerable stress then. There was a series of currency devaluations. It began with Thailand. It spread to Malaysia, the Philippines, Indonesia, even South Korea, which was this close to a government default. The IMF bailed them out, but it also imposed very tough conditions. There was a lot of discontent among Asian nations. They thought some of the IMF's demands were unfair, and that's when the idea of an Asian monetary fund was born. It was supposed to be a counter to the IMF, an institution to help Asian countries overcome financial challenges. But the idea never really took off. The proposal led to disagreements between Japan and the US. The US pushed back hard against the idea. No prizes for guessing why. The Asian Monetary Fund would have challenged the IMF. It would have weakened the American influence in Asia. So the Americans were not in favor of it. As for China, it was reluctant. It did not want to back Japan's proposal. So the plan was DOA, dead on arrival. But today it is being revived, and in very different circumstances. The American influence on the world is on the decline, and China is no longer a reluctant power. It wants to challenge American hegemony, and it's not shy of wielding its currency, the yuan, as a weapon. The war in Ukraine has also helped. It has contributed to the rise of the yuan. In Russia, for instance, the Chinese currency has already replaced the dollar. The yuan is now the most traded currency in Russia. Most of Russia's financial assets are now held in yuan. Earlier this year, Russia's finance ministry converted its assets. It developed a new structure for Russia's National Wealth Fund. And this fund now holds 60% of its assets in the Chinese yuan. The Bank of Russia is Russia's central bank, and it likes the yuan. The Russian bank now regularly advises citizens and companies to convert their assets, to move away from the US dollar and to switch to either the ruble or other friendly currencies like the yuan. That's the term they use, friendly currencies. So Russia is shifting. So are some ASEAN countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, and Cambodia. They're ditching the dollar. They're settling trade in local currencies. The trend is quite clear. The Chinese yuan is going places and it's finding takers. The American dollar is losing friends. Now to the latest from the war in Ukraine. Russia has attacked the Ukrainian port city of Odesa. It is said to have used 17 drones to bombard the city. These were the Iranian Shahid kamikaze drones. Kamikaze drones are built to crash into and destroy targets. They are suicidal drones. Russia launched 17 of them. Ukraine says it shot down 14. No casualties were reported. But why is this newsworthy? After all, Russia keeps shelling Ukrainian territory all the time. This one is being talked about because of its scale, also because the drone attack is being seen as retaliation. Retaliation for what? A recent assassination on Russian soil. On Sunday, a Russian military blogger was killed in St. Petersburg. The blogger went by the nickname Vladimir Tatarsky. His real name was Maxim Fomin. He was quite a popular figure with more than 560,000 followers on the social media platform Telegram. And he had Kremlin's patronage. The Russian state backs many such military bloggers. This man served in the war in Ukraine, and he also wrote about it. And his stance was unabashedly pro-war. Let me give you an example. This is Fomin from when Russia announced the annexation of 4 Ukrainian regions last year.
We will beat everyone. We will kill everyone. We will rob everyone who needs to be robbed. Everything will be the way we love. God is with us.
Reports say military bloggers have the Russian government's approval. They're allowed to be critical of Russia's progress in Ukraine. This is to rally public support for more decisive action. Prominent bloggers like Fomin are considered close to the Russian government, and perhaps that's why he was also assassinated. He was reportedly killed by a bomb in the shape of a statuette, a figurine. He was given this figurine in St. Petersburg when he was having a public interaction at a cafe. Here's what witnesses said.
She said, they told me at the entrance that it could be a bomb. So I left the sculpture at the entrance and she went there, returned, brought this bust in a package and then went directly to the stage, presented it to Vladimir.
And he told her, come in here. Why are you sitting so far away? Sit closer. She said, oh, I'm so shy. Well, she was sitting 3 to 5 meters from him and a minute later there was an explosion.
A suspect has been arrested. Her name is Daria Trepova. The Russian government says she's a dissident, that she has taken part in protests against President Vladimir Putin. Authorities have also accused her of being associated with jailed opposition leader Alexei Navalny. Images of her arrest were circulated by the Russian Ministry of Internal Affairs.
Do you understand why you were detained?
I do.
What for?
For being at the place where Tatarsky was killed.
What did you do?
I took the statue there that exploded.
Who gave you that statue?
Can I tell you later?
Now you may be wondering, why would Russia target Ukraine for this incident? Because the Kremlin believes that Ukraine is collaborating with dissidents within Russia and it's using them for terrorist activities. It's one of the justifications Russia uses for its war. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said, and I'm quoting, according to the National Anti-Terrorism Committee, there is information indicating that the Ukrainian special services may be involved in the planning of this terrorist act, and naturally, this is a terrorist act. Russia has come up against the Kiev regime. This is a regime that supports terrorist activities. This is a regime that is behind the killing of Daria Dugina. This is a regime that is quite likely behind the killing of Fomin and the terrorist act in St. Petersburg. This is a regime that has been behind killings for many years since 2014. This is why the special military operation is being carried out. This is their justification for the war. And he mentions one more name, Daria Dugina. She was the daughter of prominent Russian nationalist and Putin supporter Alexander Dugin. She was killed in a car bombing last August. Moscow had blamed Kiev for that assassination too. Ukraine has, of course, denied involvement in all of these incidents. A Ukrainian official said that these were domestic issues. He likened it to spiders eating each other when trapped in a jar. Ukrainian President Zelensky has also distanced himself from what's been happening in Russia and what happened in St. Petersburg.
About St. Petersburg, you know, I'm not thinking what's going on in St. Petersburg or in Moscow. They have to think, Russia has to think about their cities. I'm thinking about our country and our cities.
Despite the denials, it seems Moscow is not convinced. The intensified attacks could be Russia's way of punishing Ukraine. It could be a strong message to stop the attacks inside Russian borders, because the last thing that Moscow needs is the battle leaving the front lines and affecting its citizens at home. Our next story is about Russia's pacifist neighbor, Japan. It finds itself in an increasingly dangerous neighborhood: North Korea, China, Russia, Taiwan. It's a volatile region. Tensions are boiling over the Taiwan issue, and the war in Ukraine seems as intense as ever.
The government of Japan will keep watching Russia's military operations as they have been stepping up activity in the Far East, including areas around Japan.
Then we have China. Last year, China fired ballistic missiles. Some landed in waters close to Japan. Also in the neighborhood is North Korea. It's on a missile firing spree. One of them flew over Japan.
The series of actions by North Korea, including its repeated ballistic missile firings, are threats to peace and safety of Japan and the region, as well as the international community.
So Japan is surrounded by volatility, and it makes sense that Japan is preparing itself. It wants to build bomb shelters for its people. Japanese lawmakers are pushing for the rollout. They want a law that could be passed in less than a year. It wants shelters where citizens can take refuge in the event of a war. Is this an overreaction? Why is Japan preparing for war? Because it suffered unspeakable misery in the last war it was involved in, the Second World War. It's been 77 years, and Japan has not fought a war in all these years. But of late, Tokyo's posture has been shifting. It is working on military preparedness.
The security and defense policies in these documents signify a great change in the post-war national security strategy.
In December last year, Japan pledged to pull up its socks. It joined the arms race in Asia. It is still constrained by its pacifist constitution, a constitution that was drawn up after the Second World War. So Japan does not have an army, it has a self-defense force, and it is protected by the American security umbrella. But over the last few years, there's been a gradual shift. The constitution is still in place, but the policies are changing. Prime Minister Fumio Kishida has vowed to boost defense spending. Over the next 5 years, Japan will increase it by as much as 50%. This is a $320 billion plan. Japan wants to be ready for sustained conflict. It wants to be able to respond if enemies strike. Kishida wants to acquire missiles. He wants to secure evacuation facilities and raise public awareness. And the last 2 points are probably much needed. Let's go back to August last year. Former US House Speaker Nancy Pelosi paid a visit to Taiwan. China threw a fit. It fired a barrage of missiles, and some of those missiles landed in Japan's exclusive economic zone. It shocked the island nation. It left the people of Japan puzzled. They did not know what to do. Where should they run? There were no nearby shelter facilities. And that's when Japan realized that it was vastly underprepared. In the name of evacuation facilities, they have a wide network of subways. In case of a missile attack, this is where civilians can take shelter. But these subways are present in major cities. What do you do if you're not close to one of them? In case of a missile attack, you have 15 minutes or less to take cover. That's how much time a Chinese or North Korean missile will take to reach Japan, 15 minutes or less. Also, most of the homes in Japan do not have basements. The evacuation centers are largely for natural disasters. Most of them are not underground. Compare this with Taiwan. It has more than 100,000 shelters. Or Singapore, which is well equipped thanks to its robust rail system. So Japan needs to act urgently. It is moving away from pacificism. The shift began under Shinzo Abe, former prime minister. He said the constitution was imposed on their country by the US. But Japan is still divided on the subject. Prime Minister Kishida initially did not want to revise the constitution, but with threats looming large, he may be changing his mind. He's trying to build an argument for a stronger military. He says it's for the defense of democracy.
It is needless to say that the new measures will stay within the realms of the Japanese constitution, international law, and the domestic law. Japan's adherence to the 3 non-nuclear principles, the exclusive defense policy, and its progress as a peaceful nation will remain unchanged.
It's a complex debate for Japan. The horrors it suffered and the horrors it inflicted on others have not been forgotten. In Bangladesh, a massive fire was reported this morning. It has gutted one of the biggest markets in Dhaka. It houses thousands of shops. It is known for its affordable clothes. The cause of the fire is still not clear, but there's enough history to point at what could have happened. Bangladesh is no stranger to fires. Last month, a fire in their biggest refugee camp left thousands without shelter. It's the same story that keeps repeating itself: non-enforcement of rules and brazen administrative oversight. It keeps burning Bangladesh. Here's a report.
Dhaka woke up to these images today, an apocalyptic fire, and these are aerial shots. What you see on fire is one of Bangladesh's biggest wholesale markets, called the Bazaar. It's a go-to destination for people to get hold of affordable clothes. The market houses more than 3,000 shops, most of which are made of inflammable materials. The fire was so widespread that the armed forces had to be called in. An Air Force chopper joined the operations, showering water over the burning market. So far, no human casualties have been reported, but businesses have taken a big hit. As the fire raged on, shop owners were seen frantically running around, trying to save their goods from being burned. Some were successful, others not so much. One shopkeeper borrowed over $14,000 for the Eid season. He lost his entire stock in the fire. Most shops in Bazaar are made of tin and wood. Both are highly flammable materials. The fire broke out at about 6 a.m. Close to 50 firefighting units were deployed. But the blaze was so powerful that these units faced water shortages. Bangladesh has made a name for itself globally as a textile manufacturing hub. Global brands get their clothes manufactured in Bangladesh because the country has cheap labor. Several textile factories still have substandard working conditions. Multiple businesses are still far from ensuring the necessary safety requirements. Scores of factories lack fire alarms and water sprinklers. The condition of the markets is worse. The data paints a grim picture of the situation in Bangladesh. Over the past 2 decades, fire incidents have shot up by 4 times. Between 1990 and 2020, Bangladesh reported around 285,000 fires. Last year alone, there were 24,000 incidents of fire. To Bangladesh's credit, it has taken several steps to improve working conditions in factories. In 2013, the Accord on Fire and Building Safety in Bangladesh was signed. Within 5 years, it brought about more than 100,000 safety improvements to over 1,500 factories. The accord was replaced in 2021 by the Ready-Made Garment Sustainability Council. The council is legally non-binding, giving both brands and suppliers an easy way out. The enforcement of rules still remains a challenge. Add to that the disregard for safety rules on the ground and public carelessness. These factors further complicate the fight against the deadly fires. Bureau Report, Firstpost.
Let's turn to the Arab world. The sands are shifting, and how? Saudi Arabia is on a roll. It is now engaging with Egypt. The Egyptian president made a surprise visit. This is Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. He was in Saudi Arabia on Monday. He met with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia. This was their first meeting in months. They had a spat recently. So this is a significant turn. Also, Egypt is suffering an economic crisis, so the timing is important. Let's first tell you about the crisis in Cairo. This has a lot to do with the war in Ukraine. Egypt, like many other countries, is suffering a cost of living crisis. And it's suffering more because its currency is losing value. The Egyptian pound is falling. Its value has dropped by 50% in the last 1 year. And this is a country that depends on imports. The falling currency has devastated Egypt. It's looking for foreign funding. It got an IMF bailout last December, some $3 billion. It also got a lot of help from Arab nations like Saudi Arabia, Qatar and the UAE. They pledged $22 billion to help Egypt in 2022. $22 billion. Riyadh alone has invested more than $6 billion in Egypt in the last 1 year. But then it made an announcement. This was in Davos at the World Economic Forum in January this year. This is what Saudi Arabia's finance minister said, and I'm quoting, "We used to give direct grants and deposits without strings attached, and we are changing that. We are working with multilateral institutions to actually say we need to see reforms. We are taxing our people. We are expecting also others to do the same, to do their efforts. We want to help, but we want you also to do your part." Saudi Arabia basically said it would give money, but others should do their bit. And Egypt saw this as a rebuke. And to understand this, it's also important to understand Egypt's history. It has been in economic trouble for decades, since 1952, when Egypt saw its first military coup. About a third of its population is impoverished, and Cairo has been using subsidies to paper over the economic cracks, and Saudi Arabia has been helping it. Perhaps it's tired of paying for the Egyptian government's failings. The Saudi minister's statement led to a war of words in the media. Saudi academics slammed the military rule in Egypt. The Egyptian media, close to the government, shot back at Saudi Arabia. They said people who recently became rich because of oil money, had no right to criticize Cairo. It all got a bit ugly. And since then, President El-Sisi of Egypt has been trying to diffuse tensions. His visit to Saudi Arabia yesterday could be one more step in that direction. They haven't declared what they discussed, but El-Sisi affirmed the depth and strength of their bilateral relations in a social media post. Which brings us to our next point, Arab unity and Saudi Arabia's role in it. We've mentioned the momentous changes taking place in West Asia in recent weeks, starting with the China brokered deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran, then the impending normalization of ties between Damascus and Riyadh, and the plans to reinduct Syria into the Arab League. Now, tensions between Cairo and Riyadh, however minor, are also being ironed out. And everywhere you look, it seems Saudi Arabia is at the center of this realignment, which also begs the question, why? What is Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman planning? He's been shifting the kingdom away from its traditional allies in Washington and forging new ties with China and Russia. Case in point, the recent oil output cut. Just this Sunday, the OPEC Plus oil cartel slashed global oil production again. Saudi Arabia and Russia are both part of this group, OPEC+. The move will help Russia, which uses oil sales to fill its war chest. And Saudi Arabia will also profit from higher oil prices. When all these moves are considered, it seems Saudi Arabia under MBS is looking out for itself. It seems to be forging a new world order, one where Arab nations under the leadership of Saudi Arabia will have a greater say. What does a country need the most? You could say it needs a lot of money, an abundance of natural resources, a strong economy and military. But there's something without which every country will just be an ordinary mass of land. People. People are what make a country. So what does a country do if it runs out of people? Remember, no economy can function without people. No military can fight without soldiers. Many countries are learning this the hard way. And now some of them are taking rather desperate steps to address their intense labor shortages. They're importing workers. Here's a report.
What are some of the things humans are famous for? Scientific discoveries, medical breakthroughs, space travel, and at a more primal level, procreation, making more babies. There was a big population surge in the second half of the 20th century. But that's an era long behind us. Today, developed countries are battling low birth rates. People aren't having enough children. And not having enough of these tiny humans is leading to a big problem. Countries like Germany, Japan, and Hong Kong are now resorting to importing workers to bolster their workforce. Let's take Germany first. Last year, Germany's labor shortage rose to an all-time high. There were over 1.7 million vacant positions throughout Germany last year. The signs were there all along. For years, Germany has faced a shortage of workers in a variety of sectors. The shortage is primarily because Germany's population is aging. But COVID only made matters worse. Now, Germany is planning to import workers from outside the European Union. The cabinet has approved a plan to reform the country's immigration system. Once passed by parliament, it will become easier for skilled workers from third world countries to work in Germany. So looks like Germany has given up on its people and now has to rely on immigrant workers to keep its economy up and running. The situation is much worse in Japan, which faces a severe labor crunch. In fact, Japan's population slump has become an existential crisis of sorts. For any country to maintain a stable population, it must have a birth rate of at least 2.1. This means a woman needs to give birth to at least 2 children. But do you know what Japan's birth rate is? At 1.3, far below the average. In fact, last year, the number of births in Japan fell to a record low. Last month, an advisor to Japan's Prime Minister said that the country would disappear if low birth rate persisted. Studies say that by 2040, Japan will face a shortage of 11 million workers. The situation is grim, and as time runs out, like Germany, Japan is also turning to foreign workers. Japanese companies are offering incentives to foreign workers to woo them, from allowances to deal with inflation to salary increments to skill training. In Hong Kong, the labor shortage has reached a critical stage. Hong Kong lost over 94,000 workers last year alone, the biggest drop in its working population. And in the past 4 years, since the pro-democracy protests started, the city has lost more than 220,000 workers. It hasn't been able to recover, and the hits keep on coming. John Lee Kachil is the chief executive of Hong Kong. You can call him Xi Jinping's proxy in power. He says Hong Kong will need to import workers if local recruitments fail to ease the intense worker shortfall. Hong Kong's case is more peculiar than the others. Not only is its population aging, but there's also an exodus underway. People are leaving Hong Kong to escape the CCP and its draconian national security law, further aggravating the crisis. So, as countries battle a dwindling population and a depleting workforce, there seems to be only one solution in sight: the foreign worker.
Move aside gender-neutral God. It's now time for gender-neutral babies. Raising babies is so passé that some parents are now raising babies, meaning they're raising children without gender designation. It's a portmanteau or blend of the neutral pronoun they and the word babies. Join the two and you get babies. Now remember, gender is not the same as sex. Someone's gender need not be defined by their biological sex. So some parents are using gender-neutral pronouns for their children, like they, them, and their, instead of pronouns like he, she, him, and her, based on their anatomy. They simply see their children as kids, not boys or girls, and they're giving the children the freedom to choose their own labels. It may seem a bit extreme, this style of parenting, and yet many justify it. They say the queer community faces threats across the world. As of today, 64 countries have criminalized homosexuality. At least half of them are in Africa. Uganda is the most recent example. And we say it's another extreme. But do parents want to fight the society one baby at a time? Could they be doing more harm than good? Like confusing children who will ultimately grow up in a gendered world. They want to fight gender biases. And it's true that these biases exist. And they plague children from infancy. From the day they're born, babies are ushered into pink and blue worlds. They're dressed in different clothes, given different toys, even treated differently. Adults underestimate female children's motor skills at 11 months. They judge baby boys with high-pitched cries as less masculine. Soon children begin paying attention to this. And they start behaving accordingly at a young age. Like girls are more likely to play with pink toys. Gender-neutral parenting can help in some of these cases. It could prevent gender dysphoria, where a person feels their gender does not align with their sex and it causes distress. And this is important for transgender children who have higher rates of depression and suicide. For some, it's all very good and woke. But how woke is too woke? A set of parents don't want to dress their baby girl in a pink dress. Another doesn't want the grandparents to bathe the child. They think that this will make them biased towards the baby's gender. They be parents don't reveal their children's sex. So if someone asks them if it's a boy or a girl, brace yourselves for awkward silence. It's true that gender identity is not hardwired. It's mainly influenced by the child's environment. But how much control do you have over the environment in the first place? This trend is flourishing in mostly well-to-do enclaves, inhabited by a very small group. But what happens beyond this ecosystem? Most of the world is not buying this. Some think it's outrageous. Others ask, what happens when your non-gendered child meets the real world, which is highly gendered, stiff, even hostile? Experts say gender non-conforming kids are more likely to be bullied because life is more often than not unfair. And without the requisite coping skills, how will a child navigate the politics of gender and identity? While parents could be well-intentioned, in reality, it's like sending your child to a battlefield without really arming them, because the world can be a brutal place and honing your survival skills is a basic requisite. Raising babies is highly idealistic, but is it practical, even good for your child? We all agree that children must be protected from harmful gender stereotypes. But has this free-range parenting gone off-grid? The whole crux of the argument is that parents don't want to choose for their children. But not making a choice is also, ironically, a choice. You see, parenting is hard. And the simple truth is that the world is not a pink and blue binary. It works in shades of grey. And now it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. Starting with Spain, where a fishing vessel capsized near the northern port. 2 sailors died. We'll show you the rescue operation. In Argentina, an official was attacked by a group of bus drivers protesting against the death of a colleague. In France, the Big Air Kite World Cup 2023 has begun. And finally, what happened today in history? The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, was established. The year was 1949. The Second World War had left Europe devastated. There was a need to secure peace and cooperation. More importantly, a strategy was required to counter the threat posed by the Soviet Union. So 12 nations came together. They adopted the idea of collective defense, meaning mess with any one of us and deal with all of us. Over the years, many cracks appeared in this framework, but 74 years on, NATO has 30 members. Today, it added the 31st, that is Finland. We leave you with this. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.
Cecilia. General Paz. Cuando evacuaron a Berni, sí, hice. Le tiraron ahí en forcejeo, lo sacan a Berni. Los choferes de
Thank you.